Kansas, October 1983. The land goes flat in every direction. No hills, no shelter, just sky doing that enormous thing it does out here, pressing down on everything it can see. A gravel lot, a farmhouse that used to belong to someone. 20 men in a yard, hats in hand, watching a life get sold by the acre. A young woman in a worn canvas jacket walks to the edge of the crowd. Nobody looks at her twice. Her eyes move across the faces, stop on a man at the back, collar up, hands in his pockets, the posture of someone who already knows how this ends. She knows that face. The bidding opens. 280, 295, 310. Then her voice. Quiet, unhurried, certain. 340. The crowd turns. A man from Wichita stares at her, runs a calculation he has run 1,000 times before, gets it wrong. 14 years. A coffee can. 35 cents. The pen touches the check. Spring 1969. The sky over Pratt County, Kansas is the kind of flat, pale blue that doesn't inspire anything. That's the honest truth about a Kansas spring morning. It doesn't give you poetry. It gives you visibility, miles of it. The kind that shows you everything coming from 40 miles out. Weather trouble, the slow crawl of someone's truck down a gravel road, and lets you decide what to do about it before it arrives. Which is exactly the kind of sky to be born under if you ask anyone from around there. The Harlow place sat 4 miles west of town on ground that had been farmed since 1921 and never quite recovered from the ambitions of the man who first broke it. Old man Harlow had planted everything, tried everything, borrowed against everything. And now it was April of 1969 and Harlow's son had driven in from Tulsa with a moving truck and a look on his face that said he hadn't slept in a week. And the county auction service had set up folding tables in the yard, and men were standing around with their hands in their pockets, looking at another man's things. Farm liquidation sales have a smell to them. Diesel, old grease, rust that has been sitting in a barn so long it's become part of the air. There's something underneath that, something quieter, like the smell of decisions that cannot be undone. Faye Aldrich stood at the edge of the truck tailgate and did not notice the smell. She was 9 years old. She was wearing a red plaid flannel shirt tucked into jeans that were already dirty at the knees. From this morning, which was fine, they were always dirty at the knees, and her medium brown hair was pulled back in the way it always was. Loose, some pieces already escaping around her face. Light blue-gray eyes that didn't miss much. Didn't miss anything if you were paying attention. She was not looking at the crowd. She was looking at the can. It was a Maxwell House coffee can. The large size, red lid, sides that had gone from silver to something between rust and brown over what looked like decades. The bail handle was intact. It was sitting on the tailgate next to a box of assorted bolts and a coil of wire that nobody wanted. And the auctioneer, a man named Gessner, who did liquidations for 3 counties and had the voice of someone who had given up on being surprised by anything, picked it up by the handle and held it out to the crowd. "Somebody want this. It's heavy." Nobody moved. Faye raised her hand. There is a specific kind of laughter that a crowd of middle-aged men produces when a 9-year-old girl raises her hand to bid on a can of rusty horseshoes at a dead man's farm sale. It's not mean exactly. It's not kind either. It's the sound of people who consider themselves reasonable, finding the situation genuinely, completely funny, in the way that only things you don't understand can be funny. 23 men laughed. One of them was 22 years old. Blonde, recently hired at the Pratt County Bank, standing at the edge of the crowd because he'd come out with his father as a courtesy. His name was Monroe Pell. He laughed the loudest. Faye did not look at Monroe Pell. She was not looking at the crowd. She reached into her coat pocket and placed 35 cents on the tailgate. 3 dimes, 1 nickel, every cent she had. Gessner looked at the coins, looked at her face, found nothing to argue with in either. "Sold," he said, and moved on. Faye picked up the can. It pulled at her arm with a satisfying weight, the kind of weight that tells you there is more in something than it appears to contain. She carried it to the truck, and that was the day the story started. Except nobody knew that yet. Her father was leaning against the truck when she came back. Grant Aldrich was not a large man and not a talkative one, but he had the kind of stillness about him that fills a space without noise. He was 41 that spring, hands that were never quite clean no matter how long he spent with the wire brush. Eyes that took in information the way a good tool does, quietly, precisely, without making a fuss about it. He looked at the can in Faye's arms. He looked at her face. He said nothing. She climbed in. He got in on his side. They drove home on a gravel road that ran straight and flat the whole 4 miles, and the pale blue sky sat over them the same way it always did, and neither of them spoke. He didn't ask what she planned to do with them. She didn't explain, which is how most of their important conversations went. The Aldrich farm sat on 320 acres east of town, on ground Faye's grandfather had broken from native grass in 1922. Flat, clean. The kind of land that doesn't forgive mistakes but doesn't hold grudges either. It just shows you the next morning exactly what you got wrong. The house was ordinary, 2 stories, white paint that needed work, a porch that tilted slightly east. The shop was something else entirely. Grant had built it himself in 1958, 20 feet wide and 40 feet long. Concrete block walls, corrugated tin roof that popped and settled in temperature changes, like an old man shifting in a chair. Wood stove in the northwest corner. Workbench along the north wall, 2-inch oak planks. He had milled himself from a cottonwood that blew over in a 1955 windstorm. It ran the full length of the building. Full length. Above the workbench on pegboard he'd cut and mounted himself, hung every tool Grant owned. Arranged by function. Arranged by size. The kind of arrangement that looks compulsive to someone who doesn't understand it and completely logical to someone who does. Each tool had a label beneath it, not because Grant was likely to forget where anything went, but because he intended for someone else to remember. He had been intending that for a long time. In the southeast corner stood the forge. He'd bought it secondhand in 1961 from a man in Kingman who was retiring. Paid $40 cash, hauled it home himself wrapped in old canvas. And every October when the season turned cold, he lit it for the first time with the particular focused attention of a man who understands that fire has its own requirements and argues with none of them. Faye had been watching that forge since she was old enough to stand in the shop without getting in the way. That happened around age 4. By 6, she was handing him tools. By 8, she was being told their histories. This he said one afternoon, setting a hammer down on the bench with both hands. This came from a machine shop in Wichita that was closing in 1954. The owner's son didn't want it, thought it was obsolete. He paused. It's not obsolete, it's just old. There's a difference. He said that a lot, about a lot of things. By 9, Faye Aldrich understood the difference. The horseshoes went on a shelf along the east wall, a shelf Grant built without being asked. 3 days after the auction, while Faye was at school, he said nothing about building it. When she came home and found it, he was already back at the workbench, back at something else. She looked at the shelf. She looked at the back of his head. She started sorting. Horseshoes are not all the same thing, even if you've never thought about it. The weight varies, the width, the placement of the nail holes, 4 holes on each branch typically, but the exact position tells you something about who made them, and when, and what kind of horse they were built for. Some are flat across the toe. Some curve. Some have heel caulks worn completely smooth. Some were pulled from a living horse at the end of their useful life. Some you could tell by the way they'd been bent came off horses that went down hard and didn't get up. Faye sorted by size first, then condition, then by what she privately called feel, a category she couldn't fully name yet, but that had something to do with the quality of the iron itself. Something she understood from watching Grant work before she had the vocabulary for what she was seeing. She labeled the coffee cans in her own handwriting. Small, medium, large, cracked, raw stock. Grant walked past once while she was labeling, slowed slightly without stopping, Raw stock, he said. For when I need material but not a finished shape, she said. He walked on, but she heard it. The particular quality of silence from a man who has just heard something he expected to hear, and is still quietly relieved when he hears it. He taught her to read iron the way you read weather, not all at once, not in lessons with a clear beginning and end, in the way real knowledge transfers through proximity, through watching, through being allowed to be wrong without being made to feel stupid about it. He taught her that rust was not the end of a piece of metal. It was information about what the metal had been through. Rust meant moisture, meant time, meant the surface had been giving itself up to protect the core. You burned it back with heat, you worked it on the wheel, and what you found underneath was often cleaner than what you started with. He taught her the difference between iron worked hot and iron worked cold. You could feel it. A hot-worked piece had a memory, a directional grain from when it had been moved, while it could still be moved. A cold-worked piece had stress in it. Not bad, just different. And you needed to know which you were working with before you decided what to do with it next. One afternoon, she was 11, he had a shoe on the anvil, shaping it for one of their own horses. She was watching from the bench close enough to feel the heat off the forge. He set the hammer down and looked at the shoe. Most people see a horseshoe, he said. He picked it up with the tongs, turned it once. They see good luck. He set it back on the anvil, went back to work. I see 40 years of metallurgy. She did not write that down. She didn't need to. Some things you hear, and they are simply already inside you before you finished hearing them. You carry them without effort for the rest of your life. That was one. The collection grew, not fast, not in a way anyone outside would notice, but steadily, with the patience of someone who has a system and trusts it. Estate sales, farm clearances, the miscellaneous lots that auctioneers bundled together because they couldn't be bothered to sort. There were always horseshoes somewhere in the pile, heavy, rusty, useless to everyone else. Faye wanted every one of them. She paid with her allowance first. Then with money she earned helping neighbors during wheat harvest, driving grain cart, running the combine on her own by 14, which was 2 years younger than most people thought reasonable. Grant said nothing about it, because she was already better than he was by then, and he knew it, and she knew he knew it, and neither of them needed to say it out loud. She paid out of her earnings quietly, without explaining herself to anyone. By 13, she had more than 200 shoes, sorted and labeled on the east wall shelf. By 15, more than 400. By the time she turned 17, she had 600. Nobody in Pratt County knew this. The story they still sometimes told, not often but occasionally over coffee at the feed store, was the one about the Aldrich girl spending her whole allowance on scrap iron at the Harlow sale. They told it as a funny story, the kind you tell about children who do inexplicable things. They did not know she had been doing it for 8 years. They were not paying attention, which was it would turn out exactly the right environment for what she was building. She was a good student, good enough that her geometry teacher called her sharp in a way that meant something larger than geometry. Good enough that the school librarian started pulling books off the shelf before Faye asked, because she had learned to predict what Faye would want next. Good enough that in the fall of her junior year, a guidance counselor named Mrs. Fleck handed her a brochure for Kansas State University's Agricultural Sciences program and said, "You should think about this." Faye looked at it. "There's a scholarship," Mrs. Fleck said. "Competitive, but I think you'd get it." "I'll look into it," Faye said. She took the brochure home, put it on the kitchen table, then moved it to her nightstand when the kitchen felt too exposed. She read it every night for 2 weeks, thought about what it would look like to leave, what it would mean to go somewhere that wasn't this farm, these 320 acres, this flat county that showed you everything coming from 40 miles out. She thought about it seriously, because later when she made her decision, it needed to mean something. A choice only means what you were actually choosing against, and she was genuinely choosing. For 2 weeks. Then came the Thursday night in October, past 11. The house dark except for the kitchen light. She had come downstairs for water. Simple, ordinary. Grant was at the kitchen table, the wall phone in his hand, and he was talking in a voice she had never heard before. Not loud, not frightened, just stripped. The voice of a man describing a fact he has already finished grieving. It's not about slowing down, he said. I'm not going to argue with you about it. I understand what you're telling me. Pause. I know what 2 years means. Pause. I'm asking you to let me manage it. She stood in the hallway. She did not move. She did not need to hear more. She understood the shape of what she'd heard. Not the specifics, those would come later when she looked up what the medications in the bathroom cabinet were prescribed for what the symptoms in the pamphlet stuffed behind his nightstand described. But the outline, the structure of it. Her father had been sick. He had not told her. He had been in the shop before 5 in the morning every morning since last spring. She had thought it was the harvest. She had thought it was just who he was. She had not thought until this moment that it might be urgency, not habit. Urgency. She went back to her room, did not sleep. In the morning, she sat across from him at breakfast and looked at his hands around his coffee cup, those hands that were never quite clean. And she thought, he has been in that shop racing against something he didn't tell me about. He chose not to tell me because he decided that me leaving for college would have been the wrong outcome. He decided. For her. Without asking. And here is the part that is hard to explain to someone who didn't grow up in a house where love and silence occupied the same space. She was not angry. She understood it. She had been watching this man her whole life. She knew what kind of love this was. It didn't need to be spoken to be true. It didn't need to ask permission to be real. So she made her decision. Alone in her room on a Saturday afternoon, she tore up the scholarship application, neatly, across the middle, then across again, put it in the trash under some papers so it didn't look like a statement. She never told him she'd done it. She never told him she knew, because he would have argued. He would have said she was being foolish. He would have said, go, and she would have had to explain that she didn't want to go not because of the farm, but because she wanted to learn everything he was trying to teach her before he ran out of time to teach it. And that was not a conversation she was going to have with her father. Some things you protect by not naming them. So she stayed, and she watched. The years between 1977 and 1981 had a quality she would only be able to describe much later when she had enough distance. They looked ordinary from the outside wheat seasons, harvest the rhythms of a working farm. But they felt pressurized, like time that knew it was being counted. Grant did not slow down. He wouldn't have known how. But there were small things, the way he sometimes sat on the shop stool between tasks, which he had never done before. The way he described a process twice now when once would have been enough, not because he was unsure, but because he wanted to make certain she had it. I'm using this rod because cast iron on a crack like this needs slow heat or it'll spread. You don't rush it. You let the metal tell you when it's ready. She already knew that. He had taught her 3 years ago, but she let him tell her again because she understood what the telling was for. She kept adding to the collection, kept the labels sharp, kept the categories refined. By 1979, she had 6 dozen cans on the east wall shelf, arranged with a precision that would have seemed excessive to anyone who didn't understand what they were for. Grant never asked what the plan was. She never explained it. Which was, she was starting to understand a kind of conversation all its own. In December of 1980, Dr. Hennessy called the house on a Tuesday afternoon. Grant took the call in the kitchen. Faye was in the shop working through a batch of shoes she'd bought at an estate sale in November. She heard the phone through the wall. She did not go in. She kept working. Worked until the forge cooled and the light outside had gone gray, and her arms ached pleasantly the way they always did after a good session. When she came inside, Grant was at the table. Coffee cold. He'd been sitting there long enough for it to go completely cold. He looked up when she came in. Dinner, she said. Sure, he said. She made it. They ate. He never said what the call was about. She never asked. Because sometimes you live inside a fact that you have agreed by silence not to look at directly, and it holds its shape that way, holds together in a way it might not if you put light directly on it. She did not know if that was wisdom or avoidance. She suspected it was both. March 4th, 1981, a Tuesday. Faye was at the kitchen table working through the February accounts when she realized she hadn't heard the shop door all morning, which on a March Tuesday was not unusual. Grant could work half a day without coming up for air. She noted the absence without alarm, noted it the way she noted weather as information, not as cause. But past noon, the absence shifted, took on a different weight. She made 2 cups of coffee, carried them across the yard. The ground was hard and cold, still frost, not fully gone. The sky, that flat, pale blue that had been above this farm every spring of her life. The shop door was unlocked. She pushed it open. The wood stove had been going since morning. Warm in there, close. The forge was cold, he hadn't lit it today. The overhead light was on the single bulb above the workbench, casting flat, yellow light across the tools on the pegboard, and the surface of the bench, and the pump sitting at the near end. The Briggs pump. Harold Briggs' neighbor had brought it over 2 weeks prior. A favor Grant had offered because the man was behind on his irrigation repairs, and the season was coming. She had seen it sitting disassembled on the bench for days. Now it was reassembled, cleaned, housing wiped down, connections tight, sitting ready, complete. Grant was on the shop stool at the far end of the bench, not moving. She set both coffee cups on the bench, very carefully. The way you set something down when your hands understand something your mind hasn't formed yet. She went to him. She knew before she reached him. That kind of knowing that doesn't arrive through thought, that lives in the body before the mind gets there. She stood next to him, and the shop was warm from the stove, and the overhead light was on, and the pump sat finished on the bench beside him. He had finished the job. She noted this. Not with sentiment, with precision. The way he had taught her to note things. He had finished the job. That was the kind of man he was. That was the only eulogy that would have mattered to him, and she knew it, and she gave it to him silently, standing in the warm shop on a Tuesday in March, with 2 cups of coffee going cold on the bench. Dex came for the funeral. Drove down from Hutchinson in a truck that needed work, wearing a jacket that didn't fit the weather. The way Dex always arrived, slightly off, slightly behind, somehow still charming about it. He was her older brother. He had left the farm at 19 and built a life that was fine and complete and elsewhere, and she was glad he came. He stayed 3 days. On the second day over coffee, he suggested sideways carefully, the way Dex always suggested things that she might want to think about selling the East parcel. Just the East parcel. Give herself some breathing room. A woman running this alone, he said. That's a lot. She looked at him. I'm not running it alone, she said. I'm running it. He stirred his coffee. Fair enough. Just think about it. She thanked him. She did not think about it. On the third day, he drove back to Hutchinson, and the farm went quiet in the way farms go quiet when they belong only to one person. Not empty, not sad, just completely and specifically hers. She was 21 years old. She owned 320 acres of paid-for ground. She owned a shop full of tools, each with a history. She owned 600 horseshoes sorted and labeled in coffee cans on the east wall. She owed no one anywhere a single dollar. She found the journal on a Tuesday in April, 6 weeks after Grant died, while she was cleaning the shop. Not cleaning in the sense of making it presentable, cleaning in the sense of knowing where everything was, running her hands over every surface, opening every drawer, lifting every lid. This shop was hers now, and she needed to understand it completely. Not the way a new owner takes inventory, the way a student reviews every note before an exam that never ends. The journal was in the bottom drawer of the old wooden cabinet in the northeast corner, under a folded piece of canvas, under a box of drill bits, under exactly enough layers that you would only find it if you were looking at everything. Grant Aldrich was not a man who kept a journal. That was the first thing she understood when she opened it. This was not a diary. It was a working notebook, the kind a practical man keeps for practical reasons, with notes about seed varieties, equipment schedules, weather patterns during the worst droughts he'd survived. It read like a manual, like he was writing instructions for someone who would need them later. Which she understood as she turned the pages was exactly what he was doing. She read it standing at the workbench. Outside, the April wind moved across the yard the way it always did, flat, direct, complete. She turned to the entry for April 12, 1969. His handwriting was very neat for a man with hands like his. She had always thought that. The writing had a precision that matched the pegboard, matched the labels, matched everything he had built. The entry was short. Farm sale at the Harlow place today. F came with me. They put up a can of old horseshoes, mixed rusted, about 40 shoes, maybe more underneath. Nobody bid. Gessner held it up and said, "Somebody want this? It's heavy." F raised her hand right away. Didn't hesitate, didn't look at me first, just raised her hand. She had 35 cents in her coat pocket. She'd been carrying that 35 cents since March. I've been carrying it since she was born. She sat down on the stool. Read it again. I've been carrying it since she was born. There was more. Below the entry added later a different ink, a slightly different pressure. The way you can tell when a man has come back to a page he thought he was finished with. If she raised her hand, I was going to give her the coins. If she hadn't, I would have bought the can myself and put it on the shelf and never said a word. The coins were the question. Whether she saw what I saw in it, that was the answer I was waiting for. She saw it. I didn't have to say anything. She sat on the stool and held the journal and looked at the east wall. The coffee cans in their rows, the labels in her own handwriting. Small, medium, large, cracked, raw stock. And the newer categories she'd added over the years by iron quality, by nail hole pattern, by whether a shoe had come off a living horse or a dead one. She had been building this collection for 12 years. He had been waiting for her to build it since before she existed. Outside, the wind moved. The tin roof popped once settling. She turned forward to October 1977. The entry was 2 sentences. F turned down the scholarship today. She didn't tell me. But I know. She put the journal down on the workbench, looked at the pegboard, at the tools arranged by function, at the single empty hook near the middle one hook that had always been empty beneath a label that named no tool she'd ever seen in the shop. She had always assumed it was waiting for something to be acquired, something he hadn't gotten to yet. She looked at that empty hook for a long time. She turned one more page. January 8, 1981, 2 months before he died. Talked to Hennessy today. He gave me the numbers again. I already had the numbers. There is not much to say about numbers when you have already decided how to act. The shop is ready. The tools are where they need to be. The forge is in good condition. I had it rebuilt last fall. I told her it was just a cleaning. The pegboard is current. The collection is better than I expected. She added the subcategories last spring. I would not have thought of the subcategories myself. She is past what I can teach her, and I am not sure she knows that yet. I want to write something conclusive here, something useful. But I think everything useful has already been put somewhere she'll find it. The horseshoes she bought at the Harlow place are still on the bottom shelf of the east wall. Maxwell House can. She never moved them. I noticed that. I should have told her more things directly. Maybe. But I think she knows. The way she has always known things before she's been told. From watching. From touching. From the particular kind of attention that can't be faked and can't be taught. It was there from the beginning. And then at the very bottom of the page in smaller handwriting, as if he'd added it after everything else when he thought he was done. She'll find the coins. She'll know what they mean before she picks them up. That's how she works. Always has. She read that line 3 times. Set the journal down on the bench. Stood very still. I had put the 35 cents in the bottom of the can. The day she brought it home. She understood that now. Not because the journal said it explicitly, because everything else the journal said pointed to it with the same precision he brought to everything. He had kept those coins, placed them where she would eventually look, and he had known when she found them, she would already understand. She did not cry. Not then, not at the workbench in the April light with the journal in her hands and the coffee cans on the east wall and the pump her father had finished sitting exactly where he had left it. She wasn't suppressing anything. She just didn't cry. Because what she was feeling was not grief exactly. Not anymore. What she was feeling was something harder to name, something that had weight and temperature. The feeling of being handed a letter written 20 years ago and finding your name on it in handwriting you would recognize anywhere, and realizing the address was always correct. She closed the journal, placed it back in the bottom drawer, under the canvas, under the drill bits, stood up. She looked at the east wall, at the coffee cans in their rows, at the Maxwell House can on the bottom shelf that she had never moved. She rolled up her sleeves, and she went back to work. Outside, the April wind moved across the Aldrich farm exactly as it always had. Flat, steady, indifferent to everything except the fact that the ground was ready and the season was coming, which is if you have been raised right, all you need to know to begin. The shop smelled like him. That was the worst part. In the weeks after Grant Aldrich died at his workbench on a Tuesday morning in March, the smell had not left. Coal smoke, linseed oil on old wood, the metallic sharpness of iron that has been worked in the same room for 30 years. Faye walked in every morning and breathed it in without meaning to. And every morning her body did the same thing. It waited. Not for anything specific, just waited. Because the body is slower than the brain. The brain knew Grant Aldrich was gone. The brain had handled the paperwork, the bank, the condolences from neighbors who showed up on the porch with food she couldn't eat, the phone call to Dex and Hutchinson that went exactly the way she expected it to go. The brain had managed all of it with a steadiness that surprised even her. But the body kept walking into the shop and waiting for the sound of him. The creak of the stool, the particular way he set a tool down. Not dropped, not placed, set. With a deliberateness that said he was already thinking about the next step. She'd heard that sound her entire life. And now the shop was so quiet she could hear the wind working at the seam of the corrugated tin roof 40 feet above her head. She was 21 years old. She owned 320 acres of paid-for Kansas ground. One concrete block shop with a forge in the southeast corner. One 1968 Chevy pickup with 212,000 miles on it. One savings account at Pratt County Bank with $11,000 in it. And 614 horseshoes sorted by size, in carbon content, and nail hole pattern in labeled coffee cans on the east wall shelf. She did not own a single thing that owed money to anyone. Grant Aldrich had seen to that personally. So had his mother before him. But Faye didn't know that part yet. She found out on a Thursday in April. And the way she found out started with a vice. She had been planning the Champion Vice purchase for 6 months before Grant died. It was on his list, the one he'd left tucked into the second drawer of the workbench. 3 pages of yellow legal paper in his cramped left-handed writing. Not a will. He'd had an actual will filed properly at the county courthouse. Nothing dramatic about it. This was different. This was operational. A list of things that needed doing, organized by season and urgency. Item number 7, page 2. Champion number 1 Post Vice, Medicine Lodge, classified Pratt County paper last February, call first. She'd seen the listing herself. She'd been reading the classifieds for farm equipment since she was 12. The habit came from him. He'd taught her that the best tools were never in hardware stores. They were in barns. They were in the estates of men who had died knowing exactly what every piece was worth and had never gotten around to selling it. They were in collapsed sheds on properties that had been in the same family since the 30s. She called on a Wednesday morning. An old woman answered, widow. Didn't know much about the vice except that it had been her husband's. Heavy. The man at the implement dealer had told her it was worth something to the right person. Faye asked 3 questions. The woman answered all 3. Faye thanked her. Hung up. drove to Medicine Lodge the next morning before 7. 45 minutes each way on a flat road through country that looked identical to the country she'd left. Same winter wheat just starting to head out. Same horizon. Same sky doing that enormous Kansas thing where it takes up more of your vision than seems physically possible. The shed was worse than she'd expected. One wall had come partly down in a windstorm. The roof had shifted on its posts. The whole structure leaned about 15 degrees west. She had to duck to get in through the doorway, but the vice was there, and she knew it immediately, even in the dim light, even canted sideways against a wall of warped shelving, cast iron, heavy. The jaw housing had the curved profile of the Champion design broader at the base, and the mounting plate was still intact. She ran her hand along the screw housing. Seized, obviously. The jaws were sprung slightly. Something left too tight in them for too many years. A crack along the lower edge of the mounting plate. Not through the critical section, just the edge. Her father had fixed worse with a welding rod in 2 hours of patience. She paid $8 for it. She loaded it herself into the bed of the truck while the widow watched from the doorway in a housecoat and foam rollers, holding a cup of coffee, looking like she could not quite explain to herself what she was witnessing. A young woman in a red plaid shirt hauling cast iron at 7 in the morning. Faye drove home, unloaded it in the shop, set it on the workbench, and then she went to work on the screw. Penetrating oil first. She'd learned that from Grant, who had learned it from a machinist in Kingman who had forgotten more about seized fasteners than most men ever knew. Penetrating oil, and then you leave it. You don't force it. You don't get impatient. The oil needs time to wick into the threads. The threads have been frozen for 15 years. They are not going to move on your schedule. She left it overnight, came back in the morning, applied more oil, left it another day. On the third morning, she heated the housing with the torch, just enough to expand the metal, not enough to damage it. She felt the moment the thermal difference did its work. A small thing, a shift in the resistance. She put the wrench on it. The screw moved. She cleaned the threads with a wire wheel, worked them back and forth, slowly, adding oil, feeling for the binding points. An hour of this, maybe more. She wasn't watching the clock. There was nobody waiting on her for anything. The sun came through the south window and moved across the concrete floor while she worked. She didn't notice until it had crossed the entire width of the room. The screw came free. She was cleaning the inside of the housing when she felt it. Not the screw, not the threads, something else. A slight resistance at the back of the housing, just at the curve of the cast iron, where the screw channel made its turn. She reached in with 2 fingers. Paper. She pulled it out carefully. A cylinder of paper no thicker than her index finger. Rolled tight. Secured with a single piece of cotton string that had been sitting in the back of a seized vise long enough that it had taken on the color of the iron around it. She set it on the workbench, looked at it. Her first thought was that it belonged to the previous owner, some old machinist's note about the vise. A measurement, a repair record. She untied the string, unrolled the paper, and stopped. Because she recognized the handwriting immediately. She would have recognized it in the dark, left-handed slant. The particular way he formed his lowercase g, always too small, almost illegible. A habit she had teased him about since she was old enough to read. Grant Aldrich had put this paper in this vise. Not recently. The paper had age to it, yellowed at the edges, the ink slightly faded. He had put it here before the listing appeared in the paper, before he got sick, before he knew she was staying instead of going to Kansas State. Maybe years before any of that. She read it. A list, 23 entries, each one a location and a date. Farm sales, estate auctions, classified listings. She recognized some of them. She'd been to some of them herself, years ago, before she was old enough to drive, riding beside him in the truck. He had walked those sales, and she had walked beside him, and he had picked things up and set them down, and she had watched him choose. She had thought he was choosing for himself. He hadn't been choosing for himself. Every item on this list was something he had looked at and deliberately walked away from, leaving it for her, mapping out a circuit she didn't know existed, for a time she hadn't known was coming. At the bottom of the list, in slightly smaller writing, as if he'd added it last, "You'll know when it's time. You've always known. I just gave you the starting point." Faye sat down on the concrete floor of the shop, not because she decided to, because her legs made that decision without consulting the rest of her. She sat there for a long time. The sun moved across the floor. The wind worked at the tin roof. Outside, somewhere in the wheat, a meadowlark was doing the thing meadowlarks do in April, singing as if the whole point of existing is to fill empty Kansas sky with sound. She folded the paper back into its cylinder, tied the cotton string around it, set it on the shelf above the workbench, beside the coffee cans, and then she went back to work on the vise, because that was what you did, because he had taught her that. The education she received from Earl Dunmore happened on a single day in May, and it was one of the more remarkable days of Faye Aldrich's life, which is saying something given the year she just had. Earl Dunmore was 81 years old. He had been shoeing horses in Barber County since 1921. He had started as a teenager, apprenticed to a man who had learned the trade in the 1890s, which meant that the knowledge Earl Dunmore carried in his hands had roots that went back before the county had running water in most of its buildings. I had been trying to retire for 6 years. He had failed at this approximately 40 times, because there was always one more horse that needed doing. And he was the only person in 4 counties who could be trusted to do it correctly. And he felt a personal responsibility to the horses, even when his knees had stopped cooperating and his back had started giving him opinions about bending over. Faye had found him through his daughter, who had found Faye through Hector Briggs's wife, who had found Faye through nobody because Faye hadn't told anybody she existed yet. So the chain of information had traveled in reverse. She drove out to Earl's place on a Thursday morning with a legal pad and 4 pens. He met her at the barn in bib overalls washed so many times the denim had gone to pale gray. Work shirt under them that had started as chambray blue and arrived at something closer to the color of old concrete. He was shorter than she expected, compact, the kind of old that isn't frail, just condensed, as if decades of physical work had compressed him down to exactly what was necessary and nothing extra. He looked at her for a moment. "You're Aldrich's girl," he said. "I am," she said. "I was a good man," he said. "Yes." "Come on, then." He showed her everything. 2 hours of everything. Not 2 hours of being told. 2 hours of being shown, which is a different thing entirely. And the difference matters more than almost anything else in learning a physical trade. He showed her the tools. He showed her the weight and the purpose of each one. The pritchel, the turning hammer, the driving hammer, the clenching block. Not just what they were for, but how they were for it. The angle and the force and the rhythm that made them work instead of fight. He showed her how to read a hoof, how to see angle, how to feel a horse tell you what it needed through the tension in its leg, the shift of its weight, the way its breathing changed when you found the right spot or the wrong one. He showed her how to read iron. That part she already knew from Grant, but Earl had his own vocabulary for it, developed over 60 years. She listened to the differences between his vocabulary and her father's. She took note of where they agreed, where they diverged, and she understood that the divergences were not errors on either man's part. They were the accumulated wisdom of different hands working different horses on different ground in different decades. And all of it was useful. She did not interrupt him once. She almost did. Once. When he was describing the angle of the toe on a working quarter horse, a question that felt urgent rose up in her, and she opened her mouth and she looked at him and she closed it again. Because he was 81 years old, and he was giving her 60 years for free, and the question could wait. When he was done, he looked at her legal pad. "You write fast," he said. "I've had practice," she said. He nodded. He looked at his tools, then he looked at her. "You want these," he said. She blinked. "I was going to ask, I know what you were going to ask, he said. That's why I'm offering before you have to. She bought the lot for $22. The Pritchell tools, the turning hammer, the driving hammer, the nail pullers, the clenching block, two extra rasps, and a set of nipper handles he'd replaced the heads on 3 times and trusted more than anything he could buy new. She drove home with them in the bed of the truck, did not turn on the radio. She was thinking about the word Earl Dunmore had used. Exactly once, near the end of those 2 hours. She'd asked him what separated a good shoeing job from a poor one. He'd thought about it, really thought, which she appreciated, and he'd said, attention. The horse always knows if you're paying attention. She'd written it down, underlined it twice, because she'd heard almost exactly those words before. In the shop, in a different voice, with iron in the place of horses. Different trade, same truth. Some things do not need to be invented. They only need to be passed along. The rebuild took the rest of the spring and into summer. The champion vise went up on the end of the bench where Grant's had always been, welded back together with the technique he'd shown her for cracked cast iron. Slow heat, right rod, slower cooling. She did it 3 times before the repair satisfied her. The first 2 times she got impatient at the cooling stage. The third time she sat on the concrete floor and read an equipment catalog for 40 minutes while the iron cooled at the rate it wanted to cool. When she checked it, the repair had set cleanly. That was the whole lesson, actually. The patience was the technique. They weren't separate things. She counted her expenses when she was done. Champion vise, $8. Earl Dunmore's tool lot, $22. Forge coal first season supply, $14. Welding rod and flux for the vise repair, $3.40. Wire wheel replacement for the bench grinder, $2.10. Linseed oil and handle stock for tool restoration, $4. Miscellaneous hardware nails, rasps a new file set, $31. She added it up 3 times because she kept expecting the number to change. It didn't. $84.50. Plus 35 cents for the raw material she'd bought at a farm auction in 1969, when she was 9 years old. $84.85 total. She looked at that number for a long time. The thing it represented wasn't the money saved. The thing it represented was what you could build from what most people would throw away. If you knew how to look. If someone had taught you how to look. If that person had loved you enough to start teaching you before you were old enough to understand what the teaching was for. The first horse Fay Aldrich shod professionally belonged to Hector Briggs. Hector Briggs was 57 years old. He ran cattle on a section and a half east of Pratt. He was not a patient man, had not been a patient man for any of the 57 years he had been alive. His wife had told him approximately 800 times that this character trait was going to be his undoing. She had been wrong 800 times, which had not improved his opinion of patience. He had been waiting 9 weeks for the friar out of Kingman to come shoe his lead cutting horse. 9 weeks. The horse had thrown 2 shoes and was going uneven on the left front, and Hector Briggs was in the middle of working cattle. And an uneven horse in working cattle is about as useful as a screen door on a submarine. And when Hector called to ask what the situation was, the Kingman friar's wife said he was backed up. Could probably get there in another 2 to 3 weeks. He'd heard about Fay Aldrich at the co-op. His neighbor had mentioned it in passing. Grant Aldrich's daughter. She's doing farrier work out at the place. His neighbor had shrugged. Worth a call, maybe. Hector Briggs drove out to the Aldrich place on a Wednesday morning, not because he believed in it, because he had been waiting 9 weeks and was out of better ideas. He found her in the barn aisle with the horse in the cross ties. Blue-gray eyes that didn't look up when he came in, because she was focused on the hoof she was assessing. Running her thumb along the white line of the hoof wall with attention he recognized immediately as professional, the kind that comes from training, not from enthusiasm. He stood by the barn door and watched. She pulled a shoe from her sorted stock, took it to the forge, heated it, and brought it to the anvil. She worked it with the turning hammer, and the adjustments she made were small, precise, confident in a way that told him she had done this enough times that the shape she was making had become instinct rather than calculation. The shoe went on the hoof. She nailed it. She clenched the nails with the clenching block, working each nail in sequence, the heel of her palm setting each clinch down with a single stroke that was exactly as hard as it needed to be. She rasped the edge, set the hoof down, stepped back. She looked at Hector Briggs for the first time. He realized he'd been holding his hat in his hands without noticing he'd taken it off. "Learn that from your dad," he said. "From my dad," she said, "and about 600 horseshoes." He paid her $14. He drove home and told three ranchers what he'd seen. Not what he'd heard, not what he'd been told. What he had stood there and watched with his own eyes on a Wednesday morning in June. And that mattered, because there's a difference between a story told secondhand and a story told by someone who took their hat off without meaning to. July came, then August. By September, Faye had shod horses for 11 different operations in 3 counties. She hadn't advertised. She hadn't printed a flyer or called the co-op or done anything except exist and do good work and let Hector Briggs and his inability to stop talking do the rest. She charged $14 a horse. The Kingman Friar charged 18 to 22 plus mileage. She could usually get to you within the week. She kept her sorted stock on the east wall shelf, and she knew exactly what she had, which meant she wasn't burning time at the forge making shoes from scratch when she had the right shape already worked and waiting. Her father's system, applied to a different problem, working exactly as well as it had worked for him, quietly, steadily, without drama. And then in October of 1981, a man named Monroe Pell walked through her shop door and smiled at her. I was 34 years old, medium height, well-dressed for a small Kansas county, which meant his shirt had buttons all the way up, and his boots had been resoled recently, and his hair was combed with something in it. He worked at Pratt County Bank, had worked there for 11 years starting as a teller right out of college, currently a loan officer with aspirations that the county was too small to accommodate, but that he carried anyway. Quietly, like a suit that didn't quite fit. He had been at the 1969 auction. She recognized him the way you recognize a face that you filed away without meaning to. Not the face exactly, the shape of it, the way he held himself, slightly back, slightly above, the posture of someone who was always watching the room from a position of comfortable certainty. He had been 22 years old at that auction. He had been standing in the group of men by the auctioneer's truck when the can came up. He had laughed. She couldn't have told you at age 9 that she'd specifically noticed Monroe Pell in that crowd, but something in her memory had kept him. The way certain things get filed in the back of a drawer, not because they're important now, but because some part of you knows they will be. She noticed it now. "Miss Aldrich," he said. He looked around the shop with an expression that was generous, polite, and did not quite hide the assessment underneath it. "I've been meaning to come out. Heard you've been doing good work." "Thank you," she said. She was holding a rasp. She did not set it down. "I wanted to talk to you about something," he said. "Just a conversation, no pressure." He smiled a practice smile, not a fake one exactly, more like a real one that had been used so many times it had worn smooth. "There are programs right now through the bank for agricultural operations, modernization loans, very favorable rates." Faye looked at him. "What would I modernize?" she said. He gestured at the shop. "New forge setup, truck-mounted rig, professional anvil stand. A lot of the traveling farriers are moving to mobile setups. More efficient. Allows you to serve a larger territory." "I serve 4 counties already," she said. "I don't need a larger territory. I need to do good work for the clients I have." He nodded, as if this were a reasonable position he was giving serious consideration to. Of course, but growth is—" "I don't have a mortgage," she said. "No," he said. "I don't have an equipment loan." "No. I don't have a line of credit." A pause, just a small one. "No," he said. "I'm not looking for any of those things," she said. Another smile. slightly different from the first, slightly tighter at the corners. Well, he said, think it over. The offer stands. He left. She watched his car go down the county road from the shop doorway. She stood there for a moment, then she went back to work. She did not think about Monroe Pell again for 2 weeks. 2 weeks was how long it took for the first thing to happen. A rancher named Ferris out near the county line, who had booked her for 6 horses in November, called to cancel. No explanation. She noted it, didn't read too much into it. People change their minds. Then a week after that, a woman at the feed store who had always been friendly to Faye stopped being friendly. Not rude, just careful. The particular careful that people practice when they've heard something they're not sure what to do with. The second cancellation came, then the third. 3 clients, 3 weeks. A pattern too regular to be coincidence. She asked Hector Briggs directly. She stood in his barn and looked at him and said, "What are people saying about me?" Hector Briggs had this grace to look uncomfortable. "It's nothing solid," he said. "Tell me what isn't solid." He rubbed the back of his neck. "Some people are saying you're not doing well since your dad passed. That maybe things are getting on top of you. That maybe it's—" He stopped. "It's nothing. It's the kind of thing people say." "Who started it?" she said. He looked at her. She looked at him. "I don't know that for certain," he said. She nodded, thanked him, drove home. She drove home. She didn't have proof. She knew that. And she was not a person who operated on suspicion without evidence. But she was also not a person who ignored patterns when patterns were clearly visible. And this pattern had a shape. Monroe Pell. She thought about the 1969 auction. She thought about the man he'd been at 22. The comfortable certainty. The laugh that came not from cruelty, but from something worse. The absolute confidence that the world would continue to arrange itself according to his understanding of it. She thought about his face when she'd said the words, "I don't have a mortgage." The small tightening at the corners of that smooth, practiced smile. And she thought about the timing. 3 weeks between the rejection and the first cancellation. Long enough to not be obvious, short enough to be connected. She sat in the shop that night and thought about it carefully. The way Grant had taught her to think about a piece of metal that wasn't behaving the way it should. Not with frustration, with attention. What is this actually? What does it want to do? What's keeping it from being what it needs to be? What Monroe Pell was doing was damage control. Not because he was personally offended by her refusal, but because her existence as a successful, debt-free operation was a problem for a loan officer in a county where his business model depended on people believing that growth required borrowing. A 21-year-old woman running a farrier operation out of a paid-for shop with no credit line was a walking argument against his entire professional philosophy. She wasn't a person to him. She was a counterexample. And counterexamples needed to be managed. She understood this. She did not like it, but she understood it. And understanding a thing is the first step toward not being destroyed by it. She kept working. Dex Aldrich arrived on a Thursday in November, unannounced, which was the only way Dex did anything. He pulled up in a truck newer than anything Faye drove, walked into the shop in a down vest and clean jeans, looked around with the expression of a man who has been rehearsing a conversation for several weeks and still isn't sure how to start it. "You could have called," she said. "I did call," he said. "You didn't pick up." "I was working." "I know," he said. "You're always working." He said it without criticism. It was true. She knew it was true, but there was something in the way he said it. "What do you need?" she said. He reached into the inner pocket of the vest, pulled out a folded piece of paper. "A developer came to me," he said, "about the East Field, the 160 acres on the Schrock side." He put the paper on the workbench between them. "I know it's your land, Faye. I know I don't have a say, but I think you should look at this." She looked at him, not the paper. "The market's not going to stay where it is," he said. "Land prices are going to come down. Interest rates are killing everybody. If you sell the East Field now before the bottom falls out, you'd have enough operating capital to what, she said, to not have to worry for a while. I don't worry, she said. Faye, I don't worry, she said, because there's nothing to worry about. The farm is paid for. The shop is paid for. I don't have a note anyone can call. The land prices can do whatever they want to do. It doesn't change my situation. Dex looked at her. He looked at the shop. He looked at the coffee cans on the shelf and the tools on the pegboard in the forge in the corner. He seemed to be running some kind of internal calculation that kept coming up with an answer he didn't like. Dad almost sold it, he said. Faye went still. The East Field, he said. In '67, the drought. You were 7. You wouldn't remember. He put his hands in the pockets of the vest. He had a contract, signed it. The Schrock boy's father was going to buy it. $40 an acre. She said nothing. He came home with a contract and Mom was going through Grandma Opal's things in the upstairs closet. She found a letter. Opal wrote it to Dad in '52 when he came back from his first bad year. Before you were born. Before I was born. Dex paused. He tore up the contract the same night. The shop was very quiet. What did the letter say? Faye said. I don't know exactly, Dex said. Mom told me about it years later. She only read it once. She said Opal told him something about the land, about what it meant to hold on to something that was paid for. He shrugged, slightly uncomfortably. Something like, land is the one thing nobody can take from you when you don't let them. Faye stood very still at the workbench. She had heard a version of this idea every day of her life since she was old enough to understand language. It had come from Grant. She had understood it as his idea, his philosophy, the distilled wisdom of a man who had thought very hard about what it meant to own something and what it meant to owe something. But it hadn't started with Grant. It had started with Opal, a woman Faye had never met, a woman who had died before Faye was born, a woman who had sat down in 1952 and written a letter to her son during a bad year, and had said something true enough and sturdy enough that it had survived 30 years in a drought in 2 generations, and had arrived here, in this shop, on a Thursday night, wrapped in her brother's uncomfortable shrug. She thought about the list in the Champion Vice. She thought about her father's handwriting. She thought about 35 cents in a coffee can and 600 horseshoes sorted in labeled cans on a shelf. A tri-lobe spark pattern on hot iron. A voice at an anvil saying, most people see good luck. I see 40 years of metallurgy. She thought about Earl Dunmore saying attention, and she understood something she had not fully understood before. This wasn't Grant Aldrich's philosophy. Grant had learned it from Opal, the way she had learned it from Grant, the way Bee someday would learn it from her. The same truth moving through different hands in different decades, picking up new language in new context, but remaining itself underneath. The way iron remains iron through fire and hammer and rust and restoration. It didn't start with her father. It started with a woman whose name she'd heard her whole life, but whose face she would never see, and it had kept the farm. 3 times now, once in 1952 when Opal wrote the letter, once in 1967 when Grant read it during a drought, and now tonight in this shop when Dex put a contract on the workbench and she felt nothing in her chest that wanted to sign it. She looked at the paper. She looked at her brother. Take the contract back, she said. Dex looked at her for a long moment. Faye. I'm not selling, she said. Not loudly, not with anger, with the same tone her father had used when a thing was simply true and didn't require argument to stay true. She had heard that tone her whole life. She had not known until this moment that it would come so naturally out of her own throat. He picked up the contract, folded it, put it back in the vest. They stood there for a moment in the shop that smelled like coal smoke and linseed oil and 30 years of work by a man they both missed. You're going to be all right, he said. Not a question. I know, she said. He left before dark. She walked back into the shop and fired up the forge. 3 shoes that needed reshaping for Hector Briggs's mare. The coal caught and she worked the bellows until the fire had the right color. She picked up a shoe from the sorted stock and held it in the tongs and watched it move through the colors as it heated. Black to red to orange to the bright yellow orange that meant it was ready. She worked it over the horn of the anvil. Small corrections. One more pass through the fire. Small corrections again. She set it on the shelf to cool. Picked up the next one. Outside, the wind was doing what Kansas wind does in November, which is to say everything it wanted and nothing you asked of it. The tin roof responded with its full range of sound. The shop was warm from the forge, and the light from the fire was the orange she had loved since she was tall enough to stand beside it. She worked, and she thought about Opal's letter, and she thought about Grant's list, and she thought about Earl Dunmore saying the horse always knows if you're paying attention. And she thought about a 9-year-old girl in a wool coat with 35 cents in her pocket, standing at a tailgate in a field outside of Pratt, raising her hand. And she thought nobody laughs forever. The coal burned down. She banketed it for the morning, turned off the shop light, walked back to the house through the dark, through the cold, through the smell of turned earth in November in Kansas. She had $11,000 in the bank, no debt, 320 acres, her father's shop, her grandmother's words moving through her father's hands moving through hers, and the world's easiest prediction to make somewhere out there, land that people had borrowed too much to buy, was going to become available at a price determined not by what it was worth, but by what a bank needed to recover what it was owed. She didn't know exactly when, she didn't know exactly where, she knew it was coming, and she knew exactly what she would do when it arrived. She went inside, made coffee, sat at the kitchen table where Opal Aldrich had probably sat, and Grant Aldrich had definitely sat. She opened her notebook to a clean page, and she started writing down what she would need. The land did not disappear overnight. That is the important thing to understand. It did not happen in a single catastrophic moment. There was no one morning when a farmer woke up and found his fields gone. No single phone call, no single number that ended it. It happened the way rust happens, slowly, in places you weren't looking, in the threads and joints of a structure you trusted, until one day you apply pressure to something that should hold and it doesn't. And by then it was too late. Pratt County, Kansas, 1983. Faye Aldrich was 23 years old. She was not supposed to have more than $50,000 in the Pratt County Bank. Not by anyone's calculation. Not by the logic that had organized this county for the last decade. Young woman, single, no husband, no partner, no expanded operation, no debt, no machinery loans, no participation in the collective certainty of the late 70s that had told everyone, borrow to grow to pay, pay to borrow more. She had not participated in that certainty, so when the certainty collapsed, she was not underneath it. The interest rate hit 18% in 1981 and 18. Say that number slowly, 18%, on a loan of $200,000, which was not a large loan for a farm operation that had expanded in the late 70s because every bank in the county told you it was the smart thing to do. That was $3,000 a month in interest alone, before seed, before fuel, before maintenance, before a single kernel of wheat left the ground. At $3 a bushel, when corn dropped to $1.85. When land that had been worth $1,200 an acre in 1979 was worth $600 in 1982 and falling, and the bank had loaned against the 1979 value, and the collateral had just lost half its worth, and the note was due. Faye understood all of this mathematically, the way Grant had taught her to understand weather. You don't panic at a storm, you read it, you calculate what it will do, you position yourself accordingly, and you wait. She watched the county reorganize itself around collapse, watched it happen farm by farm, name by name, not quickly, not all at once. The way a wall comes down, one brick, then the ones beside it, then the ones that were only standing because of the ones beside them. Orville Putnam lost the North 80 in February of 1982. She had known Orville her whole life. He had brought a casserole to her porch when Grant died. He had not been reckless. He had not been greedy. He had borrowed at the going rate in 1978 when borrowing was what everyone did. And when the rate adjusted and the prices didn't, there was no room. There had never been room. There had only been the assumption that there would always be more room. That assumption had been wrong. She drove past the Putnam place on a Wednesday morning in March. The sheriff's notice was still on the gatepost. She looked at it. She did not stop. She drove home. She opened the ledger. She did the math. Again. Because she had been doing the math for 2 years. Since she first saw the rates move. Since she first understood the shape of what was coming. Not because she was smarter than Orville Putnam. Not because she was more careful or more hardworking or more deserving. Because nobody had ever offered her credit on terms she would accept. Because she was 21 and a woman, and she'd shown up at the bank for her first account with $11,000 in cash, and the impression she gave was capable enough that Monroe Pell had eventually come to her door with a loan offer she declined, which she had declined, which had turned out to be the most important thing she ever said no to. The summer of 1983 was when she started watching the foreclosure notices the way Grant had watched weather, with attention, with a notepad, specific, systematic, not hoping for anything, just reading the conditions and drawing conclusions. 4 farms in the spring, 3 more by summer. In September, the Dunbar notice went up. She had been watching the Dunbar place since before Grant died. 160 acres adjacent to the Aldrich ground on the east. Good wheatland, flat, clean, a functioning irrigation well in the northeast corner that Grant had helped the Dunbar family drill in 1959. She had walked that fence line 100 times. She had looked across it from her own ground every planting season for as long as she could remember. She had never once allowed herself to want it out loud. Wanting things out loud was a form of exposure she did not practice, but she had always known it was there. The bank set the opening bid at $280 per acre. She did the math. 160 acres at 280, $44,800. She had $54,000 in the bank. The auction was 6 weeks out. 6 weeks is a long time when you are operating a farrier business on 43 horses across 4 counties and farming 320 acres of wheat ground alone. She did not change what she was doing. She did not take on more clients. She did not cut her own expenses below the bone because there was nothing left to cut. They had never been fat. They were lean by design. She just kept working. And every 2 weeks she drove to the bank and made a deposit. And every 2 weeks the number grew. By the morning of the auction, her account held $61,200. She had run the math 11 times. She knew what she could bid. She knew where the ceiling was. She was not going to bid above her ceiling. She had not borrowed a single dollar to reach that number, and she was not going to start now. Some things are non-negotiable. That was one of them. She dressed that morning the way she dressed every morning. Red flannel shirt, the old canvas jacket, worn jeans, work boots with the right sole that had been replaced twice in 7 years, because she wore them through the soles, which was not a problem. That was the whole point of boots. She pulled her hair back, loose strands escaping at the temples. She did not fix them. She drove to the Dunbar place. The auction was already drawing a crowd when she arrived. Not large, 20, maybe 25 people, mostly men, farmers and their neighbors, and a few faces she didn't recognize. The strangers stood out, the way strangers always stand out at a foreclosure auction. They were there for different reasons than everyone else. Everyone else was there because the Dunbar place had been someone's life, and this county was small enough that that mattered. The strangers were there because it was an opportunity. She parked the truck at the edge of the gravel lot, saw him immediately. Mercer Flynn, land speculator from Wichita. She had heard his name twice in the previous 2 months, at the co-op, at the feed store. He had been working the foreclosure circuit all year. 3 counties, 6 auctions. He drove a rental car and wore a suit that was correct for a city and slightly wrong for a field outside Pratt in October. I was standing near the auctioneer's table with his hands in his coat pockets, a catalog from a land investment firm, the posture of a man who had already decided what was going to happen and was just waiting for the formality to confirm it. She noted him, filed him, and then she saw the second man, standing at the back of the crowd, collar up, hands in his pockets, expression of careful neutrality that looked from a distance like someone who had wandered in by accident. Monroe Pell, at a foreclosure auction on a Tuesday morning in October, not bidding, not with the auctioneer, not near anyone she recognized, just standing there in the back, watching, the way you watch something you have a stake in that you don't want anyone to see. She noted him, filed him, said nothing, waited. The auctioneer called the opening bid. 280 per acre, he said. Who'll start us at 280? Mercer Flynn raised his hand, clean, confident, the bid of a man who has done this before and expects to continue doing it without complication. Lester Garth, a farmer from the next county over, went to 295. His face had the look of someone who had driven a long way on a hope and was already starting to see the limits of what he'd come for. Mercer went to 310. Garth rubbed the back of his neck. That was a man reaching a ceiling. Fay said 340, not loudly, not as a statement, the way you set a tool down, with the deliberateness of someone who is not guessing. The auctioneer looked at her. Mercer looked at her. Garth looked at her. About half the crowd looked at her. She looked at the auctioneer. Because that was the only face that mattered right now, the only transaction happening. The rest of it was noise. Do I hear 350? The auctioneer said. Mercer had not looked away from her. He was doing a calculation. She could see it. The quick assessment. Who is this? Is she serious? Does she have the money? What is her ceiling? He was a man who made these calculations for a living. He was wrong this time. 350, the auctioneer said again. Mercer closed his catalog, put it inside his coat, and said nothing. Garth was already shaking his head. Going once, the auctioneer said. Going twice. The October wind moved through the dead grass along the fence line. Somewhere behind the barn, a bird she couldn't see was making a sound that felt too cheerful for the occasion. Sold, $340 per acre. Fay walked to the auctioneer's table. She signed the paperwork with the same handwriting she used for everything. Clear, unhurried. She opened her checkbook. She wrote the check. $54,440 including fees. All of it. Most of what she had built over 2 years of $14 shoeing calls and careful deposits and no debt and no drama. She wrote it in one motion, the pen moving across the check like something that had been waiting a long time to be written. The crowd was quiet. Not the polite quiet between lots. Not the impatient quiet of people waiting for the next item. The specific weighted silence that falls when a room has to reorganize what it thought it knew. About a person, about a situation, about the story it had been telling itself for years. They had been telling one story about Fay Aldrich for 14 years, since a 9-year-old girl in a wool coat put 35 cents on a tailgate and the whole county laughed. That story was done. Mercer Flynn walked to his rental car without looking at anyone. The door closed. The engine turned over. He pulled out of the gravel lot and drove toward the county road and did not look back, which Fay thought was exactly the right exit for a man who had just figured out he'd misjudged something fundamental. Lester Garth came over, took his hat off. I knew your father, he said. Most people did, she said. He looked at the ground. He'd have liked this. She signed the last page. Looked up. He already knew I'd do it, she said. I just had to wait for the price to come down. She drove home. 3 hours later, Hector Briggs called. She was in the shop. She had been in the shop since she got back, not working. just standing in it, the way she sometimes stood in it, not doing anything in particular, just being in the space. She picked up on the second ring. "Faye," Hector said. "Hector, I need to tell you something." "Okay." A pause, the kind that has weight. "Mercer Flynn, the speculator." "What about him?" "I looked into his firm after the last auction. The holding company. He doesn't own it outright." Hector's voice was careful, tight. "I called someone who does title work. Monroe Pell is listed as a principal investor." The shop went very quiet. She was standing at the workbench, looking at the east wall shelf, the labeled coffee cans, the list from the Champion Vice still rolled in its cotton string sitting above them. "How long?" she said. "From what I can tell," Hector said. "From the beginning." From the beginning. She thought about 1981, Monroe Pell in her shop doorway, the practiced smile, the loan offer, the specific, careful way he had looked around at everything she had built without debt and smiled at it in a way that did not reach his eyes. She thought about the cancellations, 3 clients, 3 weeks. She thought about October at the auction, Monroe Pell standing in the back of the crowd in his collar-up coat, with his hands in his pockets, and his expression of complete professional neutrality. Not bidding, because Mercer Flynn was bidding for him. She understood the whole shape of it now, not in pieces, all at once. The way you suddenly see a pattern in something you've been looking at for years. Monroe Pell had watched the rates rise. He had watched the prices fall. He had watched the foreclosures begin. He had seen the opportunity, the same opportunity she had seen. He had simply assumed because she was 21 and a woman and running a farrier operation out of a paid-for shop without a line of credit that she would not have the money, or the nerve, or that 2 years of careful reputation damage would have done enough work to keep her hand in her pocket when the moment came. He had been wrong about all 3, because he had never, not once in 14 years, taken her seriously enough to be accurately wrong about her. "Faye," Hector said, "he's been doing this since you turned him down. The things people were saying, the cancellations, that was him." "I know," she said. "That's 2 years of Hector," she said. "Yeah. I wrote the check this morning." A beat. He drove away in a rental car. A long silence on the line. Then something that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sigh. The sound a man makes when he has been worrying about someone for 2 years and just found out the worrying was in the end unnecessary. "Yeah," he said. "I guess you did." She hung up. She stood at the workbench. She thought about the 1969 auction. Monroe Pell at 22, standing in the group of men by the tailgate, laughing with the comfortable certainty of a young man who expected the world to continue confirming what he already believed about it. He had been building a plan to take her ground for 14 years, and he had failed. Not because she had been smarter, not because she had seen him coming and outmaneuvered him. She hadn't known it was him until 20 minutes ago. He had failed because the ground he thought would be vulnerable wasn't. Because the foundation he thought would crack didn't. Because the woman he thought had limits she didn't know about had been quietly and steadily making herself unlimitable since she was 9 years old, and nobody in the county had noticed because everybody was busy laughing. She set down the rasp she didn't remember picking up and drove to the Dunbar place. She needed to walk it, to put her boots on the ground of the land she had just bought and feel what it was. Not what the deed said, what it was. The farmhouse was empty, had been since August when the family packed what they could and left. She walked through it carefully, respectfully, not as an owner yet, as a guest in someone's ending. The linoleum in the kitchen, the hook by the back door with the ghost of a coat still impressed in the paint. A window in the front room where someone had taped black plastic over a crack and the tape had dried out and curled at the edges. She went through the rooms without touching anything that could be left alone. Then she walked to the barn. The aisle was concrete. The stalls were old but solid. She moved through it slowly, running her hand along the wood of the stall walls, feeling the grain. She came to the back corner, shelving along the west wall. Old wood, warped in places. She was not expecting anything specific. She was just walking. She was just looking. And then she stopped. Bottom shelf. Between a rusted can of something that had dried up 20 years ago and a bucket with a cracked handle. A Maxwell House coffee can. The large size. She went completely still. She knew that can, not that specific can, but she knew the weight of it, the particular stance of it. A can that had been filled deliberately by someone who knew they were filling it but wasn't entirely sure why. She picked it up, heavy. She set it on a clear stretch of shelf, worked the lid free. It had not been opened in a long time. The seal resisted. She pried it with careful pressure, and it released with a sound that was half pop and half exhale. Inside, horseshoes. She did not move, not for a long moment. There were perhaps 400 of them, sorted roughly. The larger ones toward the back, a section near the front that seemed separated by weight or quality. Not the precision sorting she had been doing since she was 12, but sorting, intention. Someone had looked at these shoes with specific attention and done something deliberate with that attention. Her hands were not steady when she reached to the bottom of the can. She noticed that, filed it. Under the shoes, something flat, folded. A piece of notebook paper, 3-hole punched, folded twice. She unfolded it. The handwriting was old, cramped. A man who held a pen the same way for 60 years, and it had never been comfortable. Pencil, not pen. Faded at the edges. She read it. I saw that little girl at the 1969 sale outside Pratt, who paid 35 cents for a coffee can of horseshoes. I thought there was something in that. I have been collecting for more than 14 years. I still am not sure what I was supposed to do with them. That was all. No name, no date. Just those sentences. Faye read the note 3 times. Then she sat down on the concrete floor of someone else's barn. Now her barn. The October light coming through gaps in the siding and long thin stripes. The can between her boots, the note in her hands. This man had been at the auction. I had been there. In 1969, he had seen her. 9 years old in a wool coat with 35 cents in her pocket. He had watched her raise her hand. He had watched the crowd laugh. And something in that moment had caught in him and not let go. Something true. Something worth pursuing. And he had pursued it for more than 14 years. He had collected. He had sorted. He had kept them the way she had kept hers, with attention and intention and patience. He had done all of that, and he had never found out what to do next. Not because he wasn't watching carefully enough, not because he lacked the patience or the intention or the instinct, because nobody had stood beside him at a forge when he was small. Nobody had said, this is what the grain of the iron tells you. This is how you read the angle of the nail holes. This is what heat does to carbon content. And this is why that matters. And this is how you take something other people have thrown away and make it into the thing it was always trying to become. Nobody had taught him the how. He had the what. He had it for more than 14 years, just not the how. The difference between her life and his, not talent, not drive, not vision, not even luck exactly. Although she had been lucky, she had been profoundly lucky. In the specific, unrepeatable way that means being born to a particular person in a particular shop in a particular county in Kansas and having that person love you in the specific language of showing and teaching and trusting you with the whole of what they knew. Without that, she had a coffee can full of horseshoes, that's all, just like him. She sat on the floor of the Dunbar barn for a long time. The light moved through the gaps. Outside somewhere, the October wind was working at something metal that needed tightening. The sound of it going back and forth, back and forth. She thought about Grant at the forge, his left-handed writing, the list in the Champion Vice. She thought about Opal's letter, a woman she would never meet who had written something true in 1952 and placed it in the world without knowing where it would land. She thought about Earl Dunmore on a hay bale. 2 hours, 60 years of knowledge, handed over like it was ordinary. Which it was. That was the whole point. The passing of knowledge looks ordinary from the outside. It happens in kitchens and barns and shop floors, in 10-minute conversations on the way to somewhere else. It looks like nothing until the moment it becomes everything. And when it doesn't happen, when it gets interrupted, when the person who held it dies before they can pass it, when circumstances or time or distance or just the ordinary chaos of life breaks the chain. You get a man with a coffee can full of horseshoes and a note that says, "I still am not sure what I was supposed to do with them." She folded the note carefully, tucked it back into the bottom of the can, replaced the lid, carried the can to the truck, set it on the passenger seat. She drove home with it, sitting beside her the way you carry something that matters. Not in a bag, not in the truck bed, just there, on the seat, in the fall light. On a county road in Kansas where the horizon was the same in every direction, and the sky was doing its enormous thing, and the wheat fields were stripped bare and waiting for whatever came next. When she got home, she put the Dunbar can on the east wall shelf, at the end of the row, the newest edition. She did not take out the note. She left it in the bottom of the can where the man had put it, where it could stay. The years that followed were quiet in the way good years are, the kind of quiet that's only visible in retrospect, when you look back and realize that what felt ordinary was actually extraordinary, just happening slowly enough that you couldn't see the shape of it while you were inside it. Faye farmed 480 acres of paid-for ground. She kept the farrier work until 1993 when her niece started offering opinions about bending over horses' feet that she hadn't requested. She scaled it back, kept the clients she chose to keep. The wheat ground produced what it produced. Some years more, some years less. The farm was paid for. The expenses were the same number every year within a few $100s. The shop stayed exactly as Grant had built it. Tools on the pegboard, forge in the southeast corner, champion vise at the end of the bench where she had welded it back together in 1981. The east wall shelf with its coffee cans, which kept growing, because she had not stopped, and because B had started. B was Dex's youngest. She had more of Grant in her than Dex had ever managed to produce, which was something Faye had noticed immediately and something Dex seemed baffled by. B had started coming out to the farm summers at age 12. She'd found the shop the first week, not because Faye led her there, because she arrived at it the way certain people arrive at the thing they were meant for, with the directness of someone who has been looking for it without knowing it had a name. By 14, she was in the shop every morning before breakfast. She asked good questions, not too many, the right ones, and she listened to the answers the way Faye had listened to Earl Dunmore, without interrupting, with the kind of attention that looked like stillness from the outside, which it wasn't. It was absorption, which is completely different. Faye watched her from the doorway the first week of that first summer, said nothing, because there was nothing to say yet. She was watching to see what the girl did when she thought nobody was watching, which is the only reliable test. Bea ran her hands along the tools on the pegboard, slowly, not picking them up, just touching, the way you learn a face in the dark. Then she found the sorted coffee cans on the east wall shelf. She picked one up, looked at the label, set it down, picked up another, read the label, set it down. "What are these?" she called toward the doorway. "Horseshoes," Faye said. B turned around. "I know they're horseshoes." A beat. "Why are they sorted?" "Because everything should be sorted." B looked at the row of cans, then looked at Faye. "Why?" "So you know what you have," Faye said. "So you're not starting from nothing every time." B considered this. Then she turned back to the shelf. "How many?" she asked. "More than when I started," Faye said. "How many when you started?" 35 cents worth." B looked back at her again, an expression that was measuring something, the way Grant had measured things, not with judgment, with attention. "That's not very many." "No," Faye said. It wasn't. That was the beginning. Faye started her on the drill press the way Grant had started Faye. Piece of scrap iron, 3 instructions, the expectation that she would work out the rest herself. She did, always did. The same eye, the same patience, the same instinct for what a piece of metal was trying to do and what it needed to be made to do instead. Faye watched it happen and recognized it with a precision that was more than familiarity. It was continuation. In the autumn of B's 16th year, on a Saturday morning in October, when the shop was cold and the forge hadn't been lit yet, Faye was standing at the workbench doing inventory when she heard the coal being shifted. The specific sound, she knew it without looking. She turned around. B was at the forge, not asking, not announcing, just doing it. The way you do something when you've been building toward it long enough that the moment it arrives, you don't need to name it out loud. She was arranging the coal, taking her time. The forge was cold, and she was thinking about it the way she thought about everything, carefully. Faye walked to the doorway and leaned against the frame. She watched B light the forge, watched her work the bellows at the right pace. Not too fast, not too slow. Watched the fire catch and build and move through the coal until the center went orange. B held her hand near it, not too close, feeling the heat. Then she picked up a piece of stock with the tongs, held it in the fire. Her face was calm, her eyes were on the iron, watching it change. The iron moved through its colors, black to red to orange to the bright yellow orange that meant readiness. B pulled it at the right moment. She carried it to the anvil. She worked it. The adjustments were small, confident. The work of someone who has been thinking about this for long enough that their hands already know. Faye said nothing, because what was happening did not need her commentary. It was already complete. The knowledge that had moved from Opal to Grant to Faye was now in B's hands at a forge in October 1985, moving through the same fire, working the same iron. And Faye understood, standing in that doorway, that this was the thing her father had been doing for her whole life. Not teaching her a trade, carrying something, handing it forward, trusting that the hands that received it would do the same thing she was doing now. Stand in the doorway and watch and say nothing, because there was nothing to say. The Farm Bureau meeting was in October of 1997. They asked her 6 months in advance. She went because they asked, and because she had something to say that was worth saying to the specific room that would be in that building on that night. The room was full, farmers and wives and faces from the extension office, and 3 people from a county newspaper. Hector Briggs in the third row with Patrice beside him. The two of them had rebuilt after 1983 in ways Faye had watched with quiet respect. Different scale, different land. Same Hector Briggs, still here, still working, still paying attention. Monroe Pell was not there. She'd heard he'd moved to Wichita, regional manager for something. She didn't know the details, hadn't needed to. She walked to the podium, no notes. She looked at the room. She said, "I want to ask you something." The room settled. "When you look at a piece of scrap iron," she said, "what do you see?" A beat. Most of you see the end of something. You see what it used to be and can't be anymore. She paused. "My father taught me to see what it could still become, if somebody was willing to do the work. He taught me that the difference between scrap and material is almost entirely a question of who's looking at it, and that the same thing is true of land, of time, of money." She looked at Hector. He was very still. "I have farmed this county for 16 years without a mortgage and without an equipment loan. I watched good farmers lose ground they worked their whole lives to build because payments came due when prices didn't." She looked at the room. "I am not smarter than those farmers. I am not a better farmer than most of them. I just had a father who taught me that a paid-for thing is the only thing a bank cannot take from you. And I believed him." She stopped. The room waited. "But what I found out later," she said, "is that it wasn't his idea. Small shift in the room. The particular readjustment of people who came expecting one thing and are realizing they might hear another. He learned it from his mother, she said, a woman named Opal. She wrote him a letter in 1952 during a bad year. I never met her. She died before I was born. She had no way of knowing her letter would keep a farm, 3 times, across 3 generations. She just wrote down what she knew and gave it to the person who needed it. She looked at the room. That's all teaching is, she said. That's all it's ever been. She stepped back. The applause started. She walked to the front row and sat down and looked at her hands and waited for the room to settle. Hector caught her eye from the third row. He nodded, one nod, slow, deliberate. The nod of a man who has had a long time to think about something and has finally fully arrived. She nodded back. The whole conversation, right there. And it was enough. After the meeting in the parking lot, cold, October, the sky doing its enormous thing overhead, stars beginning to appear at the edges, a woman came up to her. Faye didn't recognize her immediately, and then she did. The recognition came with a small physical jolt she hadn't expected, because the face had aged the way all faces do. But the placement of it in her memory was precise. The angle, the position. Standing near the tailgate of an auctioneer's truck on a spring morning in 1969 in a field outside of Pratt, Kansas. The woman was in her 60s, white hair, work-worn hands. She was looking at Faye with an expression that was not quite comfortable. I was there, the woman said, in 69 at the sale. Faye looked at her. When you bought the horseshoes, a pause. I was standing near the truck. The woman's voice was careful, practiced. I laughed. The parking lot was quiet. A car started somewhere, then stopped. I know, Faye said gently. I didn't understand, the woman said. I thought it was... She stopped. I didn't understand what I was looking at. Nobody did, Faye said. That was fine. Was it? The woman said. She said it with genuine curiosity, not guilt-seeking, wanting to actually know. Faye thought about it, actually thought about it, the way she thought about everything, without rushing to an answer. It was fine, she said, because I wasn't doing it for anyone to understand. I was doing it because my father had taught me something true. And true things don't stop being true because someone else can't see them yet. The woman looked at her for a long moment. Does it stay with you? She said. All of it. The auction, the years, the things people said. Faye thought about a man with a coffee can full of horseshoes and a note that said, I still am not sure what I was supposed to do with them. A list in a C's vice. A letter written in 1952 for a reader who wouldn't exist for another 2 years. What stays with me, she said, is the people who taught me, not the people who doubted me. The woman nodded, looked down. Thank you, she said. Take care, Faye said. She walked to the truck. B was sitting on the tailgate. 28 years old. Canvas jacket claimed from the hook by the shop door when she was 15 and never returned. Hair in a practical braid. Boots that needed resoling. She had been in the back of the room the whole time. In her hands, a horseshoe. One of the older ones from the original collection. Faye recognized it by the nail hole pattern. One of the shoes from the 1969 can. Worked over many times until it had been reduced to raw stock again. B turned it in her hands. Not looking at it exactly, feeling it. B, Faye said. B looked up. That shoe's ready, Faye said. When you are. A beat. How will I know when I'm ready? Faye opened the truck door, stood there for a moment in the cold October night. The stars overhead. The dark county road stretching in both directions. The smell of turned earth in the end of the season that meant the beginning of another. You'll know, she said. Same way I did. Same way my father did. Same way his mother did before him. She got in, started the engine. You already know. You've known for a while. You just haven't done it yet. B looked at the shoe, looked at Faye. What if I get it wrong? Faye smiled. Small, the kind that doesn't perform itself. Then you heat it back up, she said, and you try again. She drove home. The east field was dark on her left. Her ground, 480 acres of it, flat and cold and waiting for spring. The irrigation well in the northeast corner of the Dunbar section, silent and still. The wheat stubble from last year's crop barely visible in the truck headlights. New seed already in the ground. She pulled up to the house, sat in the truck for a moment. She thought about this second can, the note at the bottom. I still am not sure what I was supposed to do with them. A man who had seen the same things she had seen, who had trusted that instinct for more than 14 years without anyone to tell him how to follow it. She thought about Opal's letter, the one she had never read, the one she only knew about through her brother's uncomfortable shrug and the single sentence Dex had given her in the shop that night. Land is the one thing nobody can take from you when you don't let them. She thought about Grant at the forge, his voice over hot iron. Most people see good luck. I see 40 years of metallurgy. She thought about the journal, about the entries she had read in April of 1981 and had not stopped thinking about since. She got out of the truck, walked to the shop, turned on the light, went to the east wall shelf, found the original can, worked the lid free. She had known since the April she sat at the workbench with her father's journal that the coins were there. She had read the words he had written. She had understood what they meant before she finished the page. She had never opened the can to check. That was a choice she hadn't quite made consciously. She had wanted to leave them where he had put them until the moment she was ready to hold them. She reached past the shoes, down to the bottom, 3 dimes, 1 nickel. She wrapped her fingers around them and brought them out. 35 cents. She stood at the workbench and looked at them in her palm. This was not a surprise. That was the important thing. This was not a discovery. This was a confirmation. This was the moment of holding in her hand what she had already known with her whole mind and her whole body and every year of the life her father had spent preparing her. He had put them there the day she brought the can home from the Harlow place. He had taken them from his pocket. He had reached past the shoes to the bottom of the can and placed them there without a word. And he had carried that with him for 12 years until he died at his workbench on a Tuesday in March. Not as a secret, as a kept thing. There is a difference. A secret is something you hide. A kept thing is something you hold until the right moment. He had been holding it for her, the same way he had held the list in the vice, the same way he had held every piece of knowledge he had ever transferred to her in the specific, unhurried language of demonstration and proximity and trust. She closed her hand around the coins and stood there. In the shop that smelled like coal smoke and linseed oil, the tools on the pegboard in the order he had put them, the champion vise at the end of the bench where she had welded it back together with slow heat and the right rod and the patience of not checking it until it was ready. The forge cold in the southeast corner, waiting the way it always waited to be useful again. She had been 21 when she first welded that vise. She was 37 now. And she owned 480 acres of paid-for ground, and she had 35 cents in the palm of her hand. She put the coins back in the bottom of the can, replaced the shoes, replaced the lid, walked to the pegboard, looked at the tools in their rows, the empty hook near the middle. Still empty after all these years, she had never found the right thing to put there. She had stopped trying to find it because she understood somewhere along the way that the empty hook was not waiting for a tool she hadn't acquired yet. It was waiting for a pair of hands that hadn't arrived yet. Outside, the October wind was doing what it always did. The wheat ground stretched in both directions, new growth and old ground. The horizon the same flat line in every direction that it had been since the first morning she could remember. And somewhere in the dark driveway, a truck door closed, boots on the porch steps, the sound of Bee coming in from the cold. Faye turned off the shop light, stood for a moment in the dark. Some things don't need to be maintained. They just need to be carried, from one set of hands to the next, in labeled coffee cans, and seized vices and letters written in bad years by women who knew the truth and wrote it down anyway. In the smell of coal smoke and linseed oil in a concrete block shop in Kansas. In a 9-year-old girl raising her hand at a farm sale while a county laughed. In the simple world-altering, often unwitnessed act of teaching a child how to see. She walked back to the house, made coffee, sat at the table where her grandmother had almost certainly sat, where her father had definitely sat, where she had sat 1,000 times and would sit 1,000 more. She opened the ledger. She did the accounts for October. The numbers were what they always were. Bounded, controlled, not surprising. She closed the ledger, looked at the kitchen window, dark outside, the reflection of the room in the glass, the table, the lamp, herself. She thought about Bee on the tailgate with the horseshoe in her hands. 28 years old, the shop already hers in every way that mattered. Not because it had been given to her, because she had arrived at it the way Faye had arrived at it, the way Grant had arrived at it before her, the way Opal had arrived at whatever she had known in 1952 that she understood was worth writing down. Faye thought about what she would say to her, and then she realized she had already said it. In every morning she had not stopped Bee from firing the forge herself. In every afternoon she had answered the right question without answering the wrong ones. In the 35 cents at the bottom of a can, in the empty hook on the pegboard. The coffee was done. She poured a cup and sat in the kitchen of her paid-for house on her paid-for land and waited for morning, which was coming, the way it always came, steadily, on schedule.